What do you think the difference was between the tax collector and the priest that Jesus talked about in his stories?
Stature in society.
No. I think, society could be a part of it, but I think the two differences is, first of all, the priest really didn't know God, or he never would have stood in God's face and bragged on himself. That was the first problem. The priest really didn't know God. Oh, he went through all the right motions. He said the right things. He preached his prayers and sang the songs and threw his money in the bucket. But that was just going through motions. Whereas the tax collector, the traitor, the treasonous piece of societal waste, he knew well who he was. Some might say he didn't know God at all. Well, maybe he did know God better than the priest. The priest didn't know God, but the tax collector did know himself. You know the last person you got to tell they just lost the championship game? The team that just lost the championship game. I guarantee you, as they walk off the field, nobody in the stadium needs to tell them they lost. They are well aware of it. Been there myself. Jesus told a parable to his men. Remember, parable simply points to truth. It doesn't create it. Jesus is simply, by using parable, he's simply saying this is how things are. It's not where they should be, but this is how they are. And he used the priest, and he used the worst treasonous, traitorous piece of societal garbage that you could imagine. You know, tax collectors were even worse than the harlots and the prostitutes. If you can believe that or not. They were hated more. And that's why so many times Jesus says even the prostitutes or the harlots and the tax collectors will enter the kingdom of God before you. The tax collectors were the worst. They had their own separate category of sin. And they were hated by the Jews. They were hated by their own people. They were never allowed into the temple, and they were never allowed access to God. Somehow this guy snuck in, threw himself down on the floor in the back, beat his chest, and begged God's mercy. Couldn't even lift his eyes up. Oh, that guy knew he'd lost the game. The first thing I think we can drag out of this parable, it's kind of interesting. Maxine Dunham was interim professor and president of Asbury Theological Seminary. And he taught an interesting lesson. He told a story once. I was listening to him preach, and he told a story once. It was a funny story about the football coach of the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And the coach wanted to look good because they got into a little bowl game, and he wanted to look good on television. So he went to a tailor and bought a bolt of cloth. Or he went and bought a bolt of cloth, and then he took it to a tailor and said, "Can you make a suit for me out of this?" And it was beautiful fabric. And the guy measured and measured and measured and measured. And then he measured the cloth, did some statistics, wrote it all down. He says, "There's not enough here to make a whole suit. Maybe I can make you a jacket or a vest." And he says, never mind. So he threw it in his car. Anyway, he was going down to the seashore for a week off. He was taking a week off. He was meeting his wife down at the seashore. And he drove down, and he was coming through Tuscaloosa, Alabama, home of the Crimson Tide. And he went in, and he saw a tailor, says, "We can make a suit for anybody." So he remembered he threw that material in his trunk. So he stopped in front of the tailor, got the bolt of cloth, took it in, and says, "I'm so-and-so, coach of the University of Tennessee Volunteers. And I know I'm out of my city, but I saw your sign, and I just wondered if you can make a suit out of this material." So the guy measured them all up and did some statistics, looked at the material, and he says, I can make you a suit out of this material. In fact, I can actually make you a second pair of pants if you would like that, and maybe a vest. He says, "Well, how is that so? My tailor up in Chattanooga Knoxville said he couldn't do it." He says, "Well, to be honest with you, you're in Tuscaloosa now, and you're just not that big a man here." that Crimson Tide. It aggravates you every time. It is so easy to fall into that trap about comparing ourselves to everyone else. Sometimes we compare ourselves in order to improve ourselves. You know, I'm not as good as her at baking. Maybe I should ask her to help me learn how to bake. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when we start comparing ourselves to others in terms of spiritual righteousness, there's a problem. God says quite plainly in the scriptures, can you see as I see? Do you understand the ways of the heart as I understand them? Do you speak and hear as I speak and hear? That's when Jesus put the kibosh on that judgment deal. You shall not judge anyone. You can't see as God sees. As high, we are told, as high as the heavens are above the earth, so are the Lord's ways above yours. You're not allowed to judge. You're not allowed to compare. You know why? Because you don't have the equipment to do so. And when we start to compare with one another, that's what I jokingly call relative righteousness. You will always look righteous as long as you got some nasty relatives around you. So go out and find the nastiest people you know, hang around them, you'll be just fine. In essence, that's what the Pharisee was doing. But if he really knew God, how dare you come in my altar, stand before my presence, and brag on yourself? His own scriptures, he would have known this if he was a good priest. What is man that God should even consider him? What is any man that God should even take note of him? Our next breath is a gift of God. Our next heartbeat is a gift of God. Now, how are you going to brag on yourself there? See, the problem in this Pharisee is the Pharisee didn't really know God. He knew who he was. And he fell into that trap, that sin, whereas Jesus is saying we are not to compare ourselves to anyone. And yet we do it all the time. And as sure as I'm standing here, I don't care how successful or how good you are, someone right now is learning and training and studying and working out harder than you ever have and will one day beat you. Do you believe that? There's always somebody a little bit better, a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger, a little bit smarter, a little bit prettier, a little bit quicker. And yet we compare ourselves always, like the piece of literature I read this morning. I wish I was as pretty and as fun as that girl until she got up and was missing a leg. Or this little boy, till he couldn't see, he's blind. Or this little boy, he can't hear. Oh, the arrogance of mankind. And priests and pastors and Christians are subject to the same influences. Worst influence in our lives is often ourselves. Lord, you're lucky to have me. Yeah, right. You know, the apostles were guilty of that as well. They said, Jesus, you know, if what you say is true, then who can be saved? We've given up everything for you. And we've walked with you, and we've talked with you, and we've listened to you, and we've eaten with you, and we've studied. We're all about this God stuff. Remember Jesus' response to him? You guys think I chose you because you were the best? I think Jesus had a good laugh at that. He says, you're not the best. Oh, Lord. You guys think I chose you because you were the best? A couple of big, bear-guzzling, fist-brawling sons of thunder? Simon the Zealot, he kills Romans. Judas is a crook. I mean, what a resume those guys had. You think I chose you because you were the best. No, I chose you that God's glory can be revealed through you. But you got to stop comparing yourself. And just after he told them, they were walking on to the next city and they were arguing over who would be the greatest. Jesus said, God, you guys are just all day dumb, aren't you? And he sat them down and he took a little child and put it in the midst of them and said, there, that's the greatest right there. The child knows who he is. The child knows he's dependent upon his parents. And the child will not separate himself from that parent. You guys, on the other hand, have a way to go. Christianity is not about rules or regulations or movement or motion. It's about a relationship, a single relationship between you and God. The Pharisee in this parable did not, even though he was a religious giant in the eyes of the people, because he told them he was. He didn't know God at all. The vastness, the beauty, the mercy. He was all about comparative condemnation. Let's call it what it is. Damn that man in the back because he's worthless. He lost the game, Lord. Oh, yeah, go ahead and tell him that. He needs to know it. No, he doesn't. We are not to compare ourselves to others. Not now, not ever. Philip Yancey was called to, in his book, Measureless Mercy, in his book, Measureless Mercy. He wrote about how he was called to a conference, and you're not going to believe this, but it was a ministry to prostitutes. It was a ministry to try and get women of ill repute to come back to Jesus. And he spoke. He was asked to speak to them because he had just published his Amazing Grace book, which was actually amazing. And they said, if anybody understands grace and mercy and forgiveness, it's you, Philip. Would you please come and speak to the ladies? And there was a couple of hundred of them there. Active, working women of the night. And he preached what he considered, in his own writing, my best sermon on mercy and forgiveness ever. And afterwards, he asked a question to the people. He says, what do you think this means to you? What do you think this means to you? And he used this parable. He told about the sinner who couldn't even lift his eyes to heaven and begged God's mercy and received it. What does this mean to you? And one of the ladies stood up, and her English was kind of broken, and at first it was hard for him to understand. But what she basically said is, you know, everyone in the world has someone else they can look down on when they want to make themselves feel better. But we in this room, we do not have anyone like that. We are at our low. No one will cry for us. No one will care for us. Oh, they'll take advantage of us, but they don't care. You can't get lower than we are when we are at our low. And we have no one to condemn. People hate us. The churches really hate us. Philip says he was amazed by that answer. He felt like Jesus for a minute, saying he was amazed by the faith of this woman. She was just like the tax collector in the very story that he was preaching on. They knew themselves. And he asked him another question. He says, well, why then wouldn't you respond to Jesus? She says, you'd be surprised how many of us believe in Jesus. Because when you're that low and Jesus comes along and says, I love you still, we respond. We're not allowed in the churches. We're not allowed in the holy circles. And she said, look at how many are here today. Would you condemn us also? Whoa. Philip Yancey stood shocked. Said, I would never do such a thing. At least I pray to God I would never do such a thing. Wow. I couldn't imagine preaching in a situation like that. I couldn't imagine. I think the second thing Jesus was trying to tell us in this story, first of all, in the priest, we can't compare ourselves to other people. But secondly, in the eyes of the tax collector, when we stand before God, we need to realize we come with a whole lot of nothing. Think about it for a moment. How many of us could stand before the foot of the cross, the real cross, covered in the blood of Christ, and say, God, thanks, I'm great? No. When we come before the Lord, if we're honest with ourselves, if we know ourselves, and if we start to learn of God, we know that we come before the Lord with a whole lot of nothing. That tax collector knew it. You know, when he begged for mercy, please, Lord, have mercy on me, the word there is halaskawai. Halaskawai. And it literally means, Lord, I need your atoning sacrifice. In other words, I need a lamb because I ain't got one, to put it in the vernacular. He came in, he fell down before the Lord, and he said, Lord, I got nothing. So if I'm to be saved, you're going to have to do it. You're going to have to provide halaskalai. We translate it as merciful. Be merciful to me. But what it literally means is, Lord, you've got to give me a sacrifice or I got nothing. Atoning sacrifice. Which one went down justified? Only one, because God paid his bill. The other did not know God. The poignancy of this parable. No wonder the priests wanted to push him off the cliff. We are not allowed to compare ourselves with anybody. And most of all, we got to realize who we are, that we come before the Lord with a whole lot of nothing. Certainly nothing to brag on. C.S. Lewis tells a story in his book. I don't know if you've read it, The Great Divorce. Anybody read that? Powerful piece. He talks about how the Lord allowed a group of damned people who were destined for hell to come up and look at heaven. And the radiance of the residents of heaven just made them look like shadows, dark, ugly, gray shadows. And he asked them all, would you like to come in for a few minutes to see what you're missing? And only one soul on the group said, I'll give it a shot. And the Lord said, come in. So he went in, and of course he looked horrible compared to everybody else. They were radiant and beaming and beautiful. He was gray and ugly, and he was nasty. And then he saw one of his friends that he worked with on earth, and he says, you! What are you doing here? I was the good guy. I worked hard. I didn't steal anything from the company. You were a mess and a crook and a lazy bum. How'd you get into heaven? His answer was, I begged God for his mercy, and he granted it. And the gray, stained, nasty guy said, well, I ain't begging no one for no bleeding mercy. And the radiant man said, do it. Do it now. Beg for the bleeding mercy. It's your only salvation. Even the sinner didn't know he was a sinner in the great divorce. The tax collector did know. He knew how much he was hated. He came to God with nothing, and when he said, Lord, be merciful to me, he said, God, if you don't give me a sacrifice, a lamb, I ain't got nothing. I'm lost forever. He knew it. One of the apostles, Matthew, was a tax collector. He learned the same lesson, didn't he? the great gospel writer, started off as a piece of garbage in the back of the church. And Jesus looked upon Matthew and said, there is no sin I can't forgive, save one. And that's when you don't know God. I think Jesus' most disappointing moment was at the Last Supper. Talked about the promise of God, talked about the glory of God, talked about the kingdom of God, talked about the Spirit of God, talked about the gifts of God, the joy, the peace, everything. And then Philip looks at him and says, Lord, show us the Father. And Jesus just was crushed. I got to believe that. Philip, how long have we walked together? How can you say, show me the Father? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. If you can't believe that, then believe on the works you've seen themselves. Has anyone else ever done this stuff? It's real, Philip. But you'll never see it until you see yourself. You coming before God with a whole lot of nothing. Beg for that bleeding mercy. That's what the word means when that sinner said, Lord, be merciful to me. See, the priest didn't know God. I think the guy in the back did. He didn't know if God would respond to him, but he certainly knew where to come and ask for mercy. This parable, no wonder it aggravated everybody. We're not to compare ourselves. Well, the Pharisees loved to do that. They excluded everybody from the temple who they deemed unholy enough. We're not to go into God's eyes, into God's presence, and start bragging on ourselves. Tax collector knew that. And lastly, I'm going to say it. If you don't know how to accept grace of God and live in grace of God, you will never know God. Ever. Can you drink the cup I drink? That was the question Jesus asked his boys at the Last Supper. And they said, we can. Jesus said, oh, how long I got to work with you guys. You will drink it, but not yet. You're not ready. There are many more things I have to tell you, but I'm out of time. So I will send my Spirit, and He will lead you in truth and righteousness. But for now, get up. We must go. And of course, after that was the crucifixion. Tim Jones writes a book, and I want to close with this story. It's called Proof. Simply entitled Proof. And he's talking about living in grace. And one of the examples he uses is one from his own life, where he said he and his wife tried to have babies, couldn't do it. And finally then they adopted a child. She was a young girl, about 7, I think he said, 7. Anyway, she was a troubled girl and had been taken out of foster care and then brought back and taken out and brought back 2 or 3 times. Evidently, nobody could deal with it. And so Tim and his wife adopted this little girl. And as is always the case, a month after they adopt the little girl, then she gets pregnant. And they decided that doesn't matter, this little girl is going to be theirs. So to welcome her into the family, Tim and his wife decided, well, we'll take her down to Florida to Disney World. And we'll do the little Disney thing. We'll do the rides, and we'll do the food. We'll do the whole princess thing, and let her become just a magical little piece of Disney. And we'll spend the whole weekend down there. We'll get a hotel, and it'll just be wonderful. And, so they planned it for a couple of weeks. Well, suddenly the little girl's behavior got even worse. And Tim could not understand. He kept promising her Disney World. And it would seem she stopped eating, wouldn't eat anything. She was all sad and miserable and crying half the time. I mean, we're punishing this little girl with Disney World. If you've ever been a parent, it's more like punishing the parents with Disney World. No, I'm teasing. So anyway, the day came. They got in the car down to Florida. They came. They got the hotel room, whole 9 yards. Got it all ready. And that night, no one was sleeping. She was crying and everything. And the next day, they got up bright and early to be the first ones at the gate at Disney World. And they did. Well, they went. They had a marvelous day. It was a great day. They went on all the rides. Girls' eyes were that big. And they did the princess thing, you know, made her Snow White or Cinderella or whoever. And they did the food, the junk food. Oh, they ate and ate until they were sick. And they stayed all night, waited for the fireworks, did the whole 9 yards. The Disney complete package. Well, for a little 7-year-old girl, that's exhausting. For old guys and women that are parents, that's exhausting. Somehow we pay a lot of money to get exhausted. So they fell back into the hotel room and they just... And Tim asked his little girl, well, what did you think of Disney World? And she said to him, why did you take me? I wasn't good. I cried and I screamed and I didn't eat and I yelled at you. He said, I didn't take you for what you did or didn't do. I took you because you were mine. You're my daughter. You're my child. She never understood that. I took you because you're mine. Then she told Tim that she had been promised Disney World before, and the families would go off but leave her behind because of her behavior with a babysitter. They would take their real kids, but not her. She just thought Tim was going to leave her behind like everyone else did. He says, no, sweetheart, that's not how love works. You're our daughter. And we will love you and we will take you to Disney World because you're our daughter. My daughter. And that's a promise forever. And she went to sleep and they never had another problem with her. Which man went down from that temple justified? Oh, well, God took the priest because he was high and holy and mighty. No, he didn't know me. Jesus said, depart from me, for I never knew you. You're going to take the bad kid? He's mine, said the Lord. He's mine. Always has been. So does the priest, but the priest just doesn't know it. So are you 12, said Jesus to his men, but you just don't know it yet either. But you will. And you'll realize the love of God is without measure for those who see it, hear it, and live it. We are not to compare ourselves. When we come before God, it's not about us. It's about who God is, not who we are. And lastly, having learned of the grace of God, now go and live it. Because everyone stands in need of grace. Everyone should pray that same prayer, Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner. Let us pray. Father, your scriptures are often so simple and yet incredibly profound. I wonder if anyone reads your word any longer, seeking for this kind of truth that Jesus offers so abundantly. I would pray here today that each and every one of us, if we don't know you, can come to know you quickly and soon. I would pray that each and every one of us here put away ever comparing ourselves to another. And I would pray that each and every one here, we learn how to live not only in your grace to ourselves, but that we can extend that grace to everyone around us. Then we will be the ones justified. We pray in Jesus our Christ, that perfect example. Amen.